The federal government now has $59,338 billion in debt, liabilities, and unfunded obligations. This astronomical sum is more than the total net worth of all U.S. households, including the value of savings, real estate, corporate stocks, and private businesses.
We also want to show you a rather grim sign of our times. It's not far from here in Midtown Manhattan. The national debt has grown too large for the national debt clock. It went up back in 1989 when the nation's debt was less than $3 trillion. The debt has been piling up so fast lately they had to drop the dollar sign to make room for an extra digit as the number turned over to more than $10 trillion now and counting every second. A whole new clock with 2 extra spaces will go up next year.
Isn't it like a trillion? In the trillions or billions? It's really bad.
How do I feel about the national debt?
What scares you about it?
I don't think we're going to be able to get it under control. And it's really, actually, it is terrifying to think about that we're just plummeting more and more and more. And we really need to budget what we're doing and take it seriously right now, or we're not going to make it.
Personally, I don't think it's a good solution for myself as one of the taxpayers. But in general, raising tax is only a part of the solution. There's also other things that can be fixed or can be put into a different budget. We can also see a lot of people Senate. That's what I just read recently. They actually, after one term, they get a retirement plan for the rest of their life for just after one term. So some of us are working our whole life. We don't even make close to half of what they are doing. So I don't think just by raising tax is the solution, because it doesn't even benefit us most of the time, more to the people that have higher jobs, because they get more out of their retirement plan later on. So
I believe whatever gets us out of this hole, unfortunately, whether people are like it or not, is the good solution. Okay. I don't know specifically if raising tax, if that's what it takes, unfortunately, for everybody. I mean, it might make it harder on people, but unfortunately, people don't like government coming in, but sometimes government does have to come in and regulate a smidge to get us back on track. So, higher taxes, I'm not sure.
Social Security. A lot of people still think they can get money out of the Social Security. The truth is, it's not, actually. By the time for one person, there's 5 of us working nowadays when we go into our jobs, and 5 people are actually supporting one person that's retired by that time. Mm-hmm. So if you do the count, since we're a growing population, there's no way that we can actually make up for the missing money in Social Security.
Well, it's a huge problem. I mean, 14 trillion we're at now? 15, is it now? I mean, it's ridiculous, and it's all because of bullshit trickle-down economics. It's because of the bullshit bailouts, which we just found out the true number was 10 times what it was. It's more than half of the national debt. Those are the 2 main reasons, and then the third is just so much corruption and greed, where the money is wasted and it goes to people who don't use it for a good cause. I don't even think I believe in the money system anymore at all.
I think it's all screwed up, if you want my honest opinion about it. It can be fixed if they change a whole lot of the policy.
I mean, I think they should propose cuts to military spending. I mean, when I was in the Army, we got paid maybe $1,700 a month, and they hire these Blackwater mercenaries or whatever they're called, and they get paid $1,700 a day. I mean, do we really need them if we train? Why train the Army then? Why not have just a whole mercenary line? And if you do train the Army, then why buy the mercenaries in the first place?
So you think military spending is
It's a big reason. What is it, 460 something billion? It's one of the main reasons. We have one of the top, we're the top in military spendings in any country in the world. The top, and it's ridiculous. I don't know why America has to be such a world power when we can't even control like what happens at home. It's ridiculous.
It's good to a certain degree, but when it starts hurting the American people, pull out. If we go in to do what we needed to do, we don't need to stay there and continue doing it. You know what I mean?
But specifically the amount that we spend on military programs.
The amount we spent was a little too much. We was over there, in my opinion, a little too long. We did what we needed to do. We should have pulled out and started fixing this country. They forgot about, I cried when I saw the two towers fall. I was angry. I wanted justice. We went in, we got justice. Now let's fix America. Help the president. And it's time for the American people to wake up, take a look at the economy, and take a stand. Because you got to remember, we voted Congress in there. It was our votes that put the Republicans there, put the president there, and put anybody in office there. Who are they to control us? They're there to manage government, to make sure that there's substantial laws that we need to abide by, to make sure that everyone lives safely, that our country is safe. So yes, I'm for the military, the National Guard, to keep my country safe. Oh yeah, I'm down with that 100%. But when you start interfering with jobs, the economy, people losing their homes, kids going out on the streets with their families, and then the society looking at them as some homeless bum because they're living in their cars because they just lost their job and lost their home, that's wrong. A lot of people that's homeless are not homeless because they're on drugs, alcohol, or none of this. I don't do drugs and alcohol, but I lost a good job that was paying $25, $50 an hour, and I'm homeless 2 years trying to find a job, but there's none here. Why? Because the economy is so bad.
It all depends on what taxes you raise. That's the question, because there's always going to be more and more tax propositions, and it's not going to work if people don't have the money to pay their taxes. I mean, if you're just going to keep taxing the middle class and the lower class, there's going to be nothing left besides bums and then the billionaires. And it's ridiculous. And they get all these tax cuts because of the trickle-down economics, and they don't spend the money. They don't give us back the jobs that we need. I mean, the middle class has pretty much evaporated, disappeared, and now it's lower class and then high class and then billionaires.
Increasing taxes, I don't think it's gonna make a difference. It's just gonna hurt the economy more. Because the more you tax people, the more people are gonna uproar. Because you're taking blood from a turnip. The more taxes you charge, how is a person supposed to make a living? And, let me ask the people this. You work 30 or 40 years. Is it fair to you that they're cutting your benefits that you worked hard for? That you put your time and effort to make sure that your family is well taken care of when you're dead and gone? And you know that when you spent 20 or 30 years on a job that you paid hard-earned money into, that is your money, that you deserve to have your medical, your dental, your insurance to provide, to leave to your families. And if the government takes that away, what are your grandkids going to have? Is that fair? I don't think so. If I work 30 years, that money and my insurance should be there for my family.
I think one of the big ones, audit the Fed. I mean, you have to. A lot of people say end the Fed, but I don't think that's right. When the Fed, yeah, they fucked up in their job a lot, but they're the ones who impose the regulations. You know what I mean? And if you end them, free reign for the banks and the banking establishments, that's not going to work at all. You need to audit them and make sure they get their fucking shit straight and put them on a fucking budget. Like, that's what I see will work.
I lost a home, a good life, due to cutbacks and political greed. And I'm like everybody else, you know. I studied the Constitution, and I believe that the land was founded by the people and for the people. And I can't read anywhere in the Constitution where it says for the American dollar, even though we do need the American dollar. Don't get me wrong, we do need currency to support our families, to pay our bills. But when you use it in a different manner, there's an old saying, money is the root of all evil.
I really don't feel like it's going to have a strong impact on my personal budget or my personal career or anything that has to do with my life. I'm not feeling the effects of the debt right now, so why should I feel it in the future? One is healthcare, the other is military spending, and the other, they're entitlements. So Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, those things are financed in a way that don't have a backup plan. So there's no kind of security in regards to how they're going to be financed. And there's a difference between entitlements and discretionary spending. Entitlements are the ones that spend the most. We had a surplus when Bill Clinton was in office. He actually he raised taxes, and we had a surplus at the end of his term. But because of the last administration, there's no longer a surplus. So as long as they use the surplus efficiently and they be frugal with it, then it should be all right. According to my classes and the things I read online, it may not necessarily help the debt we're in if we raise taxes. There are other ways to create revenue, but as we all know, conservatives kind of lean towards raising taxes on anything. So I wouldn't think raising taxes would actually help the debt. Not necessarily cut social programs, but maybe restructure it in such a way that gives the beneficiaries of these social programs more of a choice. So they get to handle more of how they're going to finance their benefits. And in that kind of way, when consumers have more of a choice, they're more financially savvy and make better decisions, which in the end saves money. I believe it's necessary. I think we need a strong military. We need a strong defense, and there can be some savings made. There might be some spending that might not be necessary. So there could be a little bit more of a tight budget there, but I'm not in favor of shrinking or getting rid of any part of our military because I do think it's necessary.
My name is Mason Gaffney. I'm a professor of economics at UC Riverside. The good news is that we are able to continue borrowing from foreign countries, not because we're such a good credit risk, but other countries are even worse. So as the European Union, for example, is falling apart right now, the hot money, the investors who can invest in any country, are coming to the United States, in spite of the fact that we have this enormous debt already. So that's the good way of looking at it. The bad way is basically instead of taxing rich people, we're borrowing from them. And when you borrow, you have to pay interest. And when you get in hock, it's hard to get out of hock again. That's true of nations, it's true of individuals. The only way to do it really is to raise more money in taxes. But that's the last thing that the present Congress is willing to do. During most of my lifetime, you could count on the Republican Party to be against increasing the national debt. That was their stock in trade. And they blamed the rising national debt on the Democrats. And they blamed the Democrats' point of view on an economist named Keynes. I'm sure you've heard of him. So they called it Keynesian thinking. Well, the Republicans' antipathy to debt sort of balanced the Democrats' desire to spend for decade after decade. But then when Ronald Reagan was elected, that all changed. The Republican Party became a party of big spending and low taxes. And that's when the national debt started soaring. That was associated with an economist named Laffer, Arthur Laffer, Jr. He said if you lower the tax rate, you'll raise more revenue because people will work harder. And it was a lovely thought, but it didn't work. So under Reagan, Congress lowered tax rates, income tax rates that is, several times, and revenues fell. Not quite as much as the tax rate fell. Say if they lowered the tax rate by 10%, they might lower revenues by 8 or 7% because there was a half-truth in what Laffer said. But that wasn't enough to keep the national debt from going up. Well, then that opened the door. Then when Bush succeeded Reagan, the national debt went up even more. And Bush was more concerned with keeping taxes down than most anything else. By the way, the Cold War ended about that time, and we had a huge peace dividend, and people thought, oh boy, now we can cut loose and spend like mad. We don't have to support big military anymore. But the military kept growing anyway. We kept taking on more obligations, more wars. So public spending hasn't gone down. Taxes have gone down. The difference is debt. The USA had a very good credit rating, and it's still better than most countries. So we were able to get away with that for a long time. So during the Clinton administration, a combination of a triangulating Democrat and a right-wing Congress kept the deficit in check for 8 years. We actually had a slight surplus in there for a while. But then when George Bush the second came along, 2000, well, I don't want to sound partisan, but he didn't have the brains of a flea. And he just spent. And his vice president, Dick Cheney, became famous for saying, deficits don't matter.
But conveniently, our Republican colleagues have forgotten what Vice President Cheney told America on national television as he was waging two wars, both unpaid for. He said, quote, deficits don't matter.
When Dick Cheney said in the vice president's office and said, we prove deficits and debt don't matter, he couldn't have been more wrong. They do matter. But we can't be penny wise and pound foolish with our children's future. It makes no sense to talk about paying down the debt if we're going to collapse our education system, our investment in science and technology. If we're going to let our infrastructure deteriorate, we will never pay the debt down.
Another economist named Robert Barrow, if you want to get into the guilt of our profession, that's Barrow's thesis. He had a fancier name for it, but Cheney got the basic idea when he said deficits don't matter. So the national debt really went wild under George Bush II. For 8 years, Well, it was lots of fun while it lasted, but then in 2008 the system crashed. You can't live on debt forever. It wasn't only the federal government that was going into debt, it was the average homeowner too, because real estate values were soaring and banks made it possible to borrow on the increased equity in homes. So you had private debts, you had national debt, and don't forget we also had state and local debts. Riverside, for example, has huge, huge debts. And it's typical of cities. In fact, several cities are going bankrupt this year. Vallejo went bankrupt a couple of years ago. Orange County went bankrupt some time back. Well, when private citizens are going bankrupt and cities are going bankrupt and maybe the state of California will go bankrupt and the federal government is going bankrupt and Europe is going bankrupt, there's a problem. There's nobody left to bail us out. So that's about where we stand, except I haven't mentioned Obama. Everybody kind of hoped he'd solve all these problems, but under Obama the debt keeps going up. And he signaled that among his first acts was to hire the same economists from Wall Street that had advised George Bush. There were several. Tim Geithner is still there, but the one that was painfully obvious to us economists was Larry Summers. He was a major advisor to George Bush, and Obama kept him on board. And he said, borrow and spend, borrow and spend. So the only thing that's saving us is that other nations are worse off than we are. But it's possible for the whole world to go bankrupt. Of course, somebody's going to be the creditor, and that's the big banks. And some of them go bankrupt and then they get bailed out by the federal government, which has an almost unlimited borrowing power. Well, my first reaction is he's an idiot, but I wouldn't say that to him. I would say I've known college professors who made the same mistake. Two solutions. One is to raise taxes and the other is to repudiate the debt. It's been done. It's been done before. There have been several episodes in the history of the United States where states repudiated their debts. Indiana was a famous example back in the 1830s. They undertook a statewide program of canal building that was way beyond their means. And when they couldn't pay, they just repudiated the debts. And people said, you'll never be able to borrow again. But 10 years later, the English bankers were back there lending to them again. They were getting higher rates of return than they could get at home. So it's a complicated mixture of private and public. It's much more private than many of us think it should be, especially in recent years. I absolutely do. Some of the worst cases of intellectual corruption that I've observed are people whose secondary school education was deficient and who then went to, say, the University of Chicago or Harvard or someplace with a strong intellectual bias, and they bought the line hook, line, and sinker because they'd never learned much in high school. And then they went to when they went on the market and sold themselves to the highest bidder. And the highest bidders in the last few years have been think tanks subsidized by very wealthy people. The Koch brothers are perhaps the best known. They're behind, for example, the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. And they come out with the most extreme right-wing opinions reliably week after week, all wrapped up in pink tissue paper, very well footnoted and all that. And they have good connections with all the big Ivy League universities. Best way to avoid that, in my opinion, is to get a good start in secondary school before you even go to college.